The Luminary Court had been designed to intimidate, and Captain Ethan Blake had to admit it was working. Crystalline spires stretched impossibly high above his head, their surfaces pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to respond to the emotional states of their occupants. The air itself shimmered with suspended particles that caught and reflected light in ways that made the entire throne room feel like the inside of a living prism. He'd faced down hostile alien fleets during his military days, negotiated with crime lords in the Outer Rim territories, and even survived a diplomatic dinner with the notoriously carnivorous hegemony ambassadors. None of those experiences had prepared him for the crystalline beauty and barely concealed disdain of the Luminary Empire's royal court. Captain Blake of the Human Diplomatic Corps, announced the court herald, his voice carrying harmonics that human ears could barely process, presenting preliminary terms for the Soluminary Mutual Defense Treaty. Ethan stepped forward, acutely aware of the hundreds of luminous eyes tracking his movement. The Luminari were beautiful in a way that made his chest tight, tall, graceful beings whose skin seemed to contain captured starlight, their features delicate but sharp enough to cut glass. Their formal court dress flowed like liquid mercury, somehow managing to look both ancient and impossibly advanced. But it was the figure on the central throne that made his breath catch. Princess Seraphina was everything the intelligence briefings had described and nothing he'd actually been prepared for. Her skin shifted between pearl and silver as emotions flickered across her features, and her eyes held depths that spoke of a civilization that had been exploring the stars when humanity was still discovering agriculture. Her hair moved with its own wind, flowing around her shoulders like liquid moonlight, and when she smiled, it was with the kind of predatory grace that apex predators reserve for particularly interesting prey. "Captain Blake," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed to resonate through the crystal formations around them. "How quaint. Humanity sends a former soldier to discuss matters of interstellar diplomacy." The court tittered with laughter that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Ethan had expected this. The Luminari were notorious for their sense of superiority over what they considered younger species. He'd prepared for condescension, cultural barriers, and the kind of elaborate political theater that ancient civilizations seemed to love. What he hadn't expected was for it to feel quite so personal. "Your Highness," he began, following the formal protocols his diplomatic training had drilled into him, "I come bearing the hopes of the human commonwealth for peaceful cooperation between our—" "Peaceful cooperation," Princess Seraphina interrupted, rising from her throne with fluid grace. "Between a species that has barely mastered interplanetary travel and an empire that spans 3 galaxy clusters." She began to circle him slowly, her court watching with obvious entertainment. "Tell me, Captain, what exactly does humanity offer that the Luminary Empire might possibly need?" Ethan felt the trap closing around him. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a performance. The princess wasn't interested in treaties or alliances. She was demonstrating her superiority before her court by systematically dismantling both the proposal and his credibility. "Raw materials from our outer colonies," he replied, trying to maintain diplomatic composure despite the growing hostility in the room. "Strategic positioning for trade routes through the Perseus, our military cooperation against hegemony incursions." "Military cooperation?" The princess's laughter was like silver bells mixed with broken glass. "You would offer military assistance to beings whose technology transcended yours before your species developed written language?" The courtiers joined her laughter, and Ethan realized he was witnessing something that had probably been planned from the moment his shuttle entered Luminary space. This wasn't diplomacy, it was entertainment at humanity's expense. "Perhaps," Princess Seraphina continued, her circling becoming more predatory, "you misunderstand the nature of this audience. You stand before the court of the Luminary Empire, heirs to civilizations that flourished when your homeworld was still a ball of cooling rock. We do not form alliances with primitive species, Captain Blake." She paused directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns of light that flowed beneath her translucent skin. "We take them under our protection. We guide them. We manage them." The hall fell completely silent, the only sound the subtle harmonics of the crystal formations responding to the emotional tension in the room. Ethan could feel the weight of hundreds of alien gazes, all waiting to see how the primitive human would respond to being put so definitively in his place. Princess Seraphina's smile was radiant and terrible. In our language, Captain Blake, there is a word for creatures who exist entirely at the sufferance of their superiors. Beings who depend on our goodwill for their very survival. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried throughout the crystalline chamber. The word is Kethran. In your primitive tongue, you might translate it as, pet. The silence stretched like a held breath. The princess's luminous eyes gleamed with anticipated triumph, certain she had delivered a humiliation so complete that the human representative would either flee in shame or beg for mercy. Instead, Ethan Blake looked directly into those ancient, beautiful eyes and smiled. Only yours, your highness. The effect of Ethan's words was immediate and profound. Princess Seraphina's opalescent skin flushed with colors that human eyes could barely process, waves of rose and amber and deep gold flowing across her features like aurora borealis made flesh. The careful mask of imperial composure cracked, revealing something vulnerable and entirely unprepared beneath. The court's silence stretched from anticipatory to shocked to something approaching scandalized. Several of the Luminari nobles exchanged glances that managed to convey entire conversations without words, while others seemed frozen in the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for natural disasters. The princess began, then stopped, her usual eloquence apparently deserting her at the crucial moment. The hand she'd been gesturing with hung suspended in mid-air, trembling slightly as she struggled to regain control of both her voice and the riot of colors racing across her skin. Ethan maintained his gentle smile, genuinely puzzled by the extreme reaction his simple words had provoked. He'd meant them as a graceful way to diffuse her verbal attack, acknowledging her superiority while maintaining his own dignity. Instead, it seemed like he'd accidentally detonated some kind of cultural explosive device. "Your Highness," he asked carefully. "Have I given offense?" The question seemed to snap Princess Seraphina back to herself, though the luminous patterns beneath her skin continued their chaotic dance. "Offense?" she repeated, her voice pitched higher than before. That is, the court requires, private consultation." She gestured sharply, and the assembled nobles began filing out of the throne room with the kind of urgent whispers that suggested Ethan had just witnessed something unprecedented in Luminari court history. Several of them shot glances back at him that ranged from curious to concerned to what might have been impressed. "Captain Blake will be escorted to diplomatic quarters," the princess announced, her composure gradually returning though her skin still shimmered with residual color shifts. "We will continue these discussions at a more appropriate time." The escort that arrived consisted of 2 Luminari guards whose expressions suggested they weren't entirely sure whether they were protecting their guest or protecting their court from their guest. They led Ethan through corridors of living crystal that pulsed with gentle light, past gardens where bioluminescent flowers swayed without any discernible breeze. His diplomatic quarters turned out to be more luxurious than most hotels Ethan had stayed in during his military career. The walls were transparent crystal that could shift opacity at will, currently configured to provide privacy while still allowing views of the spectacular gardens beyond. A small waterfall cascaded from somewhere high above, filling the space with the gentle sound of flowing water and creating a mist that made everything glow softly in the eternal twilight of the Luminari capital city. "Excuse me," Ethan called to one of his guards before they could leave. "Could someone explain what just happened in there?" The guard, a young Luminari whose skin pattern suggested nervousness or possibly excitement, glanced at his companion before answering. "Captain Blake, in our culture, the response you gave to Princess Seraphina's designation carries significant implications." "What kind of implications?" "The kind that typically require extensive family negotiations and ceremonial exchange of bioharmonic resonance patterns," the second guard replied dryly. "Perhaps someone should have included more comprehensive cultural briefings in your diplomatic preparation." After the guards left, Ethan found himself pacing the crystalline chambers while trying to process what had just occurred. Through the transparent walls, he could see Princess Seraphina in the gardens below, moving among the responsive flowers with obvious agitation. Every few steps, she would pause to touch one of the bioluminescent blooms, which would immediately shift colors to match whatever emotions she was projecting. The flowers were painting a fairly dramatic picture, deep purples and shifting golds, with occasional flashes of something that looked almost like embarrassment pink. A soft chime announced a visitor, and Ethan was surprised to find an elderly luminary at his door, wearing robes that seemed to contain actual miniature stars. The being's skin was more translucent than the younger courtiers, with patterns that flowed like slow lightning beneath the surface. "Captain Blake," the visitor said with a formal bow, "I am Scholar Talaran, advisor on cultural protocols and ancient traditions. Her Highness has requested that I provide you with context regarding this afternoon's proceedings." "I'd appreciate that," Ethan replied, gesturing toward the comfortable seating area. "I seem to have stumbled into something significant without realizing it." Scholar Talaran settled into a chair that molded itself to accommodate their form, then studied Ethan with ancient eyes that held depths of accumulated wisdom. "Captain, when Princess Seraphina designated you as Kethran, she was employing what we call dominance rhetoric, language designed to establish hierarchical relationships and demonstrate superiority. That part one understood. However, the scholar continued, your response, accepting the designation with such specificity, invoked entirely different cultural protocols. The phrase, only yours, transforms the relationship from general subservience to what we term chosen bonding. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Chosen bonding? In ancient Luminari tradition, a Kethran, who declares exclusive loyalty to a specific individual, is making a statement of profound trust and emotional commitment. It implies willingness to place one's well-being entirely in another's hands, but only that person's hands. The scholar's expression grew more serious. What makes your response particularly significant is that it places the responsibility for that trust squarely on the recipient. By accepting you as only hers, Princess Seraphina becomes personally accountable for your protection, your honor, and your well-being. Through the crystal walls, Ethan could see the princess still pacing among flowers that continued to shift through an increasingly dramatic spectrum of colors. And she wasn't expecting that level of responsibility? "Captain Blake," Scholar Talaran said gently, "in 3,000 years of recorded Luminari history, no member of the royal family has ever accepted a chosen Kethran from another species. The cultural implications are unprecedented." The next morning brought a formal summons that arrived via floating crystal messenger. Apparently even interdimensional diplomatic crises required proper paperwork. Ethan was requested to attend Princess Seraphina for private consultation regarding cultural clarifications, which sounded ominous enough to make him grateful for the diplomatic immunity his credentials theoretically provided. He found her in what his escort described as the contemplation garden, a space where crystalline trees grew in impossible spirals around pools of water that seemed to contain liquid starlight. The princess sat beside one of these pools, her usual elaborate court dress replaced by something simpler that still managed to look more elegant than anything humans had ever designed. "Captain Blake," she said without looking up from the luminous water. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss." Ethan settled onto what appeared to be a bench grown from living crystal, noting that the responsive plants around them were displaying much calmer colors than they had the previous evening. "Your Highness, I want to apologize if my response yesterday caused any." "Do not apologize," she interrupted, finally meeting his eyes. "Your words were honest. Refreshingly so, in a court where honesty is often considered a liability." She gestured toward the pool, where patterns of light swirled in hypnotic displays. "Do you know what these pools are for, Captain? Some kind of meditation aid? Reflection, in the most literal sense. The liquid responds to emotional resonance, showing us truths we might otherwise ignore." Princess Seraphina's expression grew thoughtful. "Last night, it showed me something I had not expected to see." Ethan waited, sensing that interrupting would be a mistake. "Loneliness," she said quietly. "The pools reflected my own isolation back at me, and I realized that for all my power, all my status, I have spent centuries surrounded by people who fear me too much to truly see me." She turned to face him directly, and Ethan was struck by how different she seemed from the imperious figure who had dominated the throne room. When you said, "only yours," you were not just accepting a position of subservience. You were offering something I had not realized I wanted, genuine choice in companionship. I'm not sure I understand. Princess Serafina stood and began pacing along the pool's edge, her movements more natural than the calculated grace she displayed in court. In Luminari society, relationships are typically determined by political advantage, genetic compatibility, or social obligation. The concept of someone choosing to belong specifically to you, not because they must, but because they wish to, it is both foreign and compelling. Ethan felt like he was navigating a diplomatic minefield without a map. Your Highness, I should clarify that my response was intended to acknowledge your authority while maintaining dignity for my species. I wasn't trying to invoke ancient bonding protocols, she asked with what might have been amusement. Yes, Scholar Talaran explained the cultural complexity to me as well. You stumbled into something significant without meaning to. She paused her pacing to study him with an intensity that made him acutely aware of how alien and ancient her intelligence was. The question now becomes, what do we do with this unprecedented situation? Before Ethan could respond, a new voice cut through the garden's tranquil atmosphere. What we do is correct this embarrassment before it damages the Empire's reputation further. The speaker was clearly high-ranking Luminari nobility, his skin patterns more elaborate than even the princesses, with robes that seemed to contain swirling galaxies. His expression suggested he'd found something particularly distasteful and was considering various methods of disposal. High Counselor Vexon, Princess Serafina said with careful formality. I was not expecting you. Clearly not, given the reports reaching the High Council about your interaction with this primitive envoy. The counselor's gaze swept over Ethan with obvious disdain. The court is buzzing with speculation about your emotional display, Princess. Such behavior is beneath the dignity of the imperial line. Ethan felt the temperature in the garden drop several degrees, though he wasn't sure if that was literal or just his imagination responding to the sudden tension. My behavior, Princess Serafina replied, her voice taking on the same crystalline hardness she'd displayed in the throne room, is my own concern. Your behavior reflects upon the Empire, High Counselor Vexon countered. This creature's presence has already caused too much disruption. I have prepared documents for his immediate deportation from Luminari space. The princess's skin began displaying patterns that Ethan was learning to associate with anger, deep reds and aggressive golds that made the surrounding plants rustle nervously. You forget yourself, Counselor, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the crystal trees. Captain Blake is under my personal protection. As your chosen Kethran. The counselor's laugh was ugly. Princess, surely you cannot be serious about maintaining this farce. The implications alone. The implications, Princess Serafina interrupted, rising to her full height with imperial authority radiating from every gesture, are that Captain Blake has placed his trust in me, and I have accepted the responsibility that trust entails. She moved to stand beside Ethan, and he could feel the power emanating from her like heat from a forge. By ancient law and royal prerogative, I declare him under the protection of the Crimson Star, answerable only to me. High Counselor Vexon's expression cycled through surprise, outrage, and what looked like genuine concern. Princess, you cannot possibly understand what you are doing. A chosen bond with an alien species, the precedent alone could destabilize. Could create new possibilities for the Empire, she finished. Something we have not had in far too long. The counselor stared at both of them for a long moment, then bowed with exaggerated formality. As you wish, Your Highness. But the High Council will hear of this decision. After he left, the garden fell silent except for the gentle sounds of water and growing crystal. Princess Serafina remained standing beside Ethan, her skin gradually returning to calmer colors. Well, she said finally, it appears we are committed to this path, Captain Blake. Are you sure about this? Ethan asked. I don't want to cause problems for you with your government. Princess Serafina looked down at him with an expression that was part amusement, part determination, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Captain," she said, "for the first time in centuries, I am interested in discovering what problems might be worth causing." The political crisis that followed Princess Serafina's declaration of protection lasted 3 weeks and became the most entertaining scandal in Luminari court history. High Counselor Vexon had indeed reported to the High Council, which had responded with a formal investigation, emergency sessions, and enough bureaucratic outrage to power a small star system. Ethan found himself in the unique position of being simultaneously under royal protection and diplomatic investigation, which meant he attended formal hearings where ancient Luminari nobles debated the cultural implications of his existence while Princess Serafina sat beside him radiating protective authority that made even the most senior counselors think twice about their phrasing. "The precedent is dangerous," argued Counselor Euthera during one particularly heated session. "If the princess can claim exclusive bonding rights with any alien species, what prevents other nobles from similar indulgences?" "The precedent," Princess Serafina replied with crystalline precision, "is that trust and loyalty transcend species boundaries. Something the Empire might benefit from remembering as we encounter new civilizations." Ethan had learned to stay quiet during these exchanges, partly because his diplomatic training suggested it was wise, and partly because watching Princess Serafina defend their unusual arrangement with passionate eloquence was both impressive and oddly touching. She had transformed from the cruel courtier who had tried to humiliate him into someone who genuinely seemed to value his presence. Their private conversations, initially formal attempts to navigate the cultural crisis, had gradually become something more substantial. She was brilliant, lonely, burdened with responsibilities that had shaped her into a weapon when she might have preferred to be a person. He was pragmatic, curious, and apparently one of the few beings in the galaxy willing to argue with her about everything from interstellar law to the proper way to prepare coffee. "You realize," she said one evening as they walked through gardens where bioluminescent flowers bloomed in response to her contentment, "this arrangement has solved a problem I did not know I had." "What problem is that?" "Honest counsel," she replied. "For my entire life, advisors have told me what they believed I wanted to hear, or what would advance their own positions. You tell me what you actually think." Ethan considered this. "Is that because I'm your Kethran, or because I'm too ignorant about Luminari politics to know better?" "Both, I suspect." Her laugh was genuinely amused rather than the sharp weapon she'd wielded in court. "Though I prefer to think of it as cultural immunity to our traditional forms of manipulation." The crisis reached its climax when the High Council issued an ultimatum. Princess Serafina could maintain her unprecedented arrangement with the human, but only if she formally acknowledged the political implications by incorporating him into the diplomatic negotiations as her official cultural advisor. "They think they are calling your bluff," Scholar Talaran explained during a private consultation. "The position would require Captain Blake to participate in complex interstellar negotiations for which his species has no experience. They expect failure, which would justify dissolving the arrangement." Princess Serafina's response was to accept the challenge immediately and announce that the human Luminari negotiations would be expanded to include comprehensive cultural exchange programs, joint scientific initiatives, and mutual defense agreements. "You want to turn this into actual diplomacy?" Ethan asked, slightly overwhelmed by the scope of what she was proposing. "I want to prove that what began as accident can become intention," she replied. "Your species and mine have much to offer each other, Captain. Perhaps it is time both our governments realized that." The negotiations that followed were unlike anything in interstellar diplomatic history. Ethan brought human practicality and innovative thinking to problems the Luminari had considered solved for millennia, while Princess Serafina's ancient wisdom and vast resources opened possibilities that humanity had never imagined. More importantly, their partnership demonstrated something that both species needed to see, that cooperation could be based on mutual respect rather than dominance, that differences in age and development could be strengths rather than barriers, and that sometimes the most profound connections formed in the most unexpected ways. 6 months later, Ethan stood in a crystalline throne room where their story had begun, wearing ceremonial robes that marked his unique position as both diplomatic envoy and royal companion. The Human-Luminari Alliance had been signed with great fanfare, witnessed by representatives from dozens of species who marveled at the diplomatic breakthrough achieved through what historians were already calling unprecedented cultural synthesis. "So," Princess Seraphina said during a brief break in the formal ceremonies, "do you regret accepting the role of my Kethran, Captain Blake?" Ethan looked around the throne room, now filled with beings from across the galaxy celebrating an alliance that would reshape interstellar politics for generations to come. Human scientists were already collaborating with Luminari researchers on projects that promised to revolutionize everything from faster-than-light travel to biological engineering, while Luminari artists were discovering inspiration in human concepts of organized chaos and controlled innovation. "Only yours, Your Highness," he replied with the same gentle smile that had started everything. The blush that spread across Princess Seraphina's luminous features was visible even to the alien ambassadors in attendance, and her response carried clearly through the crystal halls, "And only mine you shall remain, my dear captain, if you choose to be." The court's reaction to this public declaration of mutual choosing was everything from shocked to delighted to diplomatically intrigued, but Ethan barely noticed. He was too busy appreciating the way Princess Seraphina's eyes held not just ancient wisdom, but genuine affection for the human who had accidentally become exactly what she hadn't known she needed. Later, when the formal histories were written, scholars would debate the precise cultural mechanisms that had transformed a moment of intended humiliation into the foundation for interstellar cooperation. But those who were present would always remember the simple truth at the heart of the miracle: sometimes the most powerful words are the ones spoken without calculation, offered freely and accepted with equal grace. And sometimes, being someone's pet was really just another way of saying you had chosen each other.